It's early June, the year 793. The North Sea is grey and choppy. You can taste the salt on the air. From across the water, a few ships with dragon-headed prows slice through the waves. They're making for the east coast of England, for the holy island of Lindisfarne. This isn't a friendly visit. You watch as the doors to the monastery of St. Cuthbert are kicked in. The air, once filled with quiet prayer, now rings with screams and the clash of steel. Precious artifacts are plundered, monks are slaughtered where they stand, and the holy place is set ablaze. Now this isn't the first time Vikings have raided England or Ireland. But this is different. Attacking a monastery, a place of God, sends a shockwave of horror across Christian Europe. For historians looking back, this bloody raid is the opening act. The Viking Age has begun. For the next few centuries you see them turn Europe upside down. England is invaded piece by piece, starting in 865, and by the early 11th century it falls under the rule of a Danish king. In France they carve out a semi-independent territory that you now know as Normandy. By the year 1000 their fingerprints are everywhere, from the forgotten corners of the North Atlantic to the busiest ports of the Mediterranean. The age finally sputters to an end in 1066. Harald Hardrada, a legendary Viking king, dies during a failed invasion of England. History fades into stories. Stories fade into legends. During the 13th and 14th centuries, mostly in Iceland, scribes begin writing down the old tales, the sagas. They tell of the legendary kings of the Viking Age, and a few of these sagas speak of a king who ruled Sweden and Denmark, who led raids on England, whose story was told for generations, and is still being told today. A legendary Viking king named Ragnar Lothbrok. Most of the sagas that tell Ragnar's tale trace his lineage back to the legendary Scandinavian king Ivar Vidfamne. The story gets a bit tangled here, like a family tree hit by a storm. Ivar's granddaughter marries a Slavic king, and their son, Sigurd Ring, eventually takes the throne. After a great battle, the Battle of Bråvalla, Sigurd Ring unites Denmark and Sweden under his rule. He reigns from around 770 to 804. He marries a woman named Alfhild, and from this union, Ragnar Lothbrok is born. Now here's the funny thing about the sagas. They don't focus much on Ragnar's battles or his heroics. They're more interested in his complicated personal life. His wives, in particular, are depicted as extraordinary characters with stories of their own. His first wife is Thora. To win her hand, you hear the story of how Ragnar had to slay a vicious serpent. Classic hero stuff. Then there's Lagertha. She fought alongside him in bloody battles and on overseas raids, but her name only appears in a 12th century Danish history, the Gesta Danorum. That little detail makes historians raise a skeptical eyebrow about whether she was a real person. His third wife is the subject of one of Scandinavia's most vivid love stories, Aslaug, the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the shield maiden Brynhildr. From these marriages, Ragnar has at least 7 sons. The most famous? Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Ubbe Halfdan, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. According to the 13th century saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, each of these sons grows up to become a famous Viking warrior. Their fame spreads across all of Scandinavia. So much so, in fact, that Ragnar's own heroic deeds start to feel overshadowed. You can almost picture it. Ragnar, getting on in years, feels his legacy slipping away. So, he gathers his most trusted men, hops on 3 ships, and leaves Scandinavia behind. His goal? To invade England with just a handful of men and reclaim the glory of his younger days. It ends in total disaster. He lands in the kingdom of Northumbria, where King Ella, who holds a personal grudge against him, captures him. Ella has heard the stories. He knows of Ragnar's legendary feats and believes no ordinary weapon can kill him. So he gets creative. He has Ragnar thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. England has faced dozens of disasters from the North Sea. But what's coming next is the apocalypse itself. Ragnar's sons, filled with rage and hatred, gather an army of thousands. They assemble a fleet of hundreds of ships and set sail for England to avenge their father. Within a few years, King Ella will be dead, and the Vikings will have conquered most of England. This is the story the sagas tell. It's a classic medieval tale sprinkled with fantastic elements. Some accounts say Ragnar fought a dragon to win Thora. It's because of tales like this that historians are skeptical, not necessarily of Ragnar's existence, but of the reality of his story. And think about this. Almost all of these sagas were written down 300 years after Ragnar supposedly lived. Trying to find the historical man in that thick fog of legend is incredibly difficult. So, where do you even start? How do you untangle the myth from the man? Surprisingly, the starting point isn't Ragnar. It's his sons. They are the most real thing we have about him. Modern research tells us that some of the men named in the sources as Ragnar's sons actually lived. For example, you know that a Bjorn Ironside was raiding cities along the Seine River between 857 and 875. You know that an Ivar and an Ubbe were among the leaders of the great Viking army that invaded England in 865. You think Ivar died in Dublin in 873, and Ubbe died in a battle near Devon in 878. The exploits of these famous Viking leaders are all over the 9th century records. You know for a fact they were real historical figures. But here's the problem. When you compare the sagas to the actual historical records, something doesn't line up. In the sagas, these Viking leaders who terrorized medieval Europe are all Ragnar's sons. But the contemporary 9th century Anglo-Saxon and Frankish records, they don't say a single word about who their father was. What's more, there's no record confirming that Bjorn, Ivar, Halfdan, Ubbe, and Sigurd were even brothers. The sources describe them as independent war leaders, acting on their own. So how did this connection get made over the years? Let's follow the breadcrumbs left in the historical records. The first historical text to mention Ragnar appears around 1070. A Norman historian, William of Jumièges, writes that the famous Viking king Bjorn Ironside's father was a man named Lothbrok. That's it. Nothing more about Ragnar. A few years later, the name pops up again. The chronicler Adam of Bremen writes that Lothbrok was the father of the cruel King Ivar who invaded England. Then, around the 1130s, an Icelandic writer named Ari Thorgilsson is the first to put the names together. Ragnar Lothbrok. By the 12th century, the stories of Ragnar have become full-blown legends, passed from person to person. The greatest warriors of the 9th century are now officially identified as his sons, and at this moment, Ragnar transforms from a possible historical figure into a legendary character. Still, historians keep searching for a real Ragnar. They have a few candidates. The most widely accepted is a Danish Viking leader named Reginherus, who besieged Paris in 845. You don't know much about him. Other than that, he sailed up the Seine with a fleet of 120 ships and about 4,000 men, plundering cities along the way. Frankish records say he was a cruel and savage man, an image certainly helped by the fact that he captured 111 Frankish soldiers and had them executed on an island in the Seine. Another candidate is a man named Lothbrok, from the 12th century Annals of St. Neots. The story goes that in 878, after winning a battle, the English raided a Viking camp and captured a magnificent banner called the Raven. According to the annals, this banner was woven by the daughters of this Lothbrok. A third candidate is a Viking leader named Ragnar, mentioned in the Gesta Danorum. But some historians suggest he and Reginherus, the attacker of Paris, are the same person. The Frankish records say Reginherus died in Denmark shortly after leaving Paris. However, the Gesta Danorum records Ragnar leading a major expedition to Dublin in 851. If they are the same person, then he didn't die as early as the Franks thought. Despite all these candidates, historians have a much more interesting idea. What if Ragnar wasn't a single person at all? What if he's a legendary figure? A composite character inspired by several famous Viking leaders who lived around the 9th century. Maybe Reginherus, Ragnar and Lothbrok are all part of the recipe. But it's impossible to know for sure who did what. This brings us to the most crucial question. Why did the sagas create such a hero? Why was he needed? Throughout history, you see rulers tracing their lineage back to legendary figures, even mythological ones, to rise to power and gain legitimacy. The kings of Sparta, for instance, claimed descent from the Greek hero Heracles. The founder of Rome, Romulus, was said to be the son of the war god Mars. History is full of these manufactured family trees, many of them deliberately created by dynasties wanting to build their power on a solid foundation. Today, historians believe that starting in the 900s, some Viking kings took a similar path to consolidate their power. Guthrum, who invaded England between 880 and 890, and Cnut the Great, who ruled as King of England, Norway and Denmark in the early 11th century, are among them. Both trace their ancestry back to Ragnar. Notice a pattern? Any king who wanted to invade or hold on to England claimed descent from Ragnar, arguing they had a right to the lands conquered by his sons. So let's read the whole story backward for a moment. It might make more sense. You're at the end of the Viking Age. The kings invading England in the 10th and 11th centuries need to legitimize their rule. They need to connect themselves to the Viking kings who ruled there before. The most suitable candidates are the Viking leaders who invaded England in 865. Then an idea emerges. Why not create a legendary Viking lineage by making all these historical conquerors brothers? From there, it's just a matter of imagination for court historians and saga writers. The famous Viking leaders who invaded England are finally gathered under one family banner. All the great kings are united in his bloodline, and this man's name was Ragnar Lothbrok. So was he a real historical figure? Did Ragnar really live? It's incredibly hard to say today. The available data doesn't allow you to make a final judgment on how much of Ragnar's story is real and how much is legend. But if you had to give an answer, remember this: historians are more skeptical of the story attributed to him than of his actual existence, and that, in the end, makes the Ragnar we know today a figure woven almost entirely from the threads of legend. The Viking forging of a nation. The history of all humanity is complex, but the geography of Russia is perhaps one of the most difficult to understand. Studying Russian history has proven to be a complicated and challenging task, even for the intellectuals, thinkers, and historians born in Russia. Despite its difficulty, the importance of Russian history for the world, and especially for European history, is undeniable. With its vast forests, relentless rivers, and desolate steppes, the Russian lands have witnessed some of the most significant and sometimes most tragic events in human history. It's impossible to look at the development of the states established in Russia as a single cohesive story. For centuries, these immense territories were controlled by vastly different administrations, both culturally and socio-economically. However, like any historical process, it's possible to trace this development back to its roots. And perhaps one of the most interesting parts of Russian history is its starting point. In the 9th century, the dynasty that gained power over the peoples of Russia and ruled them for nearly 800 years wasn't even a Slavic dynasty. For 800 years, Russia was ruled by a family that came from other lands, a family that was culturally and ethnically different from its own Slavic people. So, how exactly did that happen? To understand this, you need to look at the situation in Russia at the beginning of the 9th century and the environment in which the Slavic peoples lived. The Slavs were a people divided into different tribes, living in a vast area stretching from around Novgorod in the north of Russia to the southern shores of present-day Ukraine. The tribes that made up this people traded with the surrounding states and from time to time fought with each other. No Slavic tribe could establish a definitive, long-term superiority over another. There was a constant state of struggle among them, and this situation continuously damaged the trade routes. While the Slavic lands suffered from constant uncertainty and war, the Vikings, who had set sail from the cold shores of Scandinavia to conquer the world, were living their golden age. For Europe, the situation had become untenable. The Vikings would come, plunder, and leave. A few years later, they would come again, and this process would repeat itself at regular intervals. European kings had not found a way to deal with this in the short term. The Vikings, enriched by these raids, established new kingdoms, centers, and bases, from which they continued their raids more effectively. It was during this period that a Viking leader named Rurik came to the north of the lands inhabited by the Slavs, the lands we call Russia today. The Slavs living in the north initially resisted Rurik's forces and tried to drive him away. However, some among them saw the Vikings' power as an opportunity to solve their own complex situation. They invited Rurik as a leader to rule them and to use his power to put an end to the endless conflicts. Rurik accepted the invitation of the tribal leaders, and thus the foundations of the first Russian state were laid. There are different theories about the origin and use of the word Rus, which we use today. But if you look at the situation from a broad perspective, the word Rus eventually came to refer to some of the Slavic groups that collaborated with Rurik, and, over the years, the Scandinavian warriors who became Slavicized. So, how did Rurik establish order? What did he do that the Slavs couldn't, which led to the establishment of the first organized state on Russian soil? First, you need to understand that in the Middle Ages it wasn't possible to build a state by developing only in civilian areas. At least in the geography where Rurik lived, it was impossible. Rurik used the physical strength and combat skills of the Scandinavian warriors with him to destroy the tribes that did not obey his command or force them under his rule through threats. However, being strong and good at fighting was only one of the reasons for the success of Rurik and his followers. Rurik was showing the different tribes how they could act as a single body. The Vikings' goal was to capture a large area from the north to the south of the Slavic lands and to control the new trade routes over these regions. Rurik knew well that a disorganized, quick raid would not work and would not be sustainable. Therefore, thinking of the future, he began to act step by step. Settlements had to be captured one by one. A supply line had to be established for the border regions, and in this way the troops fighting at the borders had to be constantly supported. For this to be done, the settlements captured as bases had to be protected, suitable for trade, and developed. Rurik, who captured some settlements with the help of the warriors and tribes under his command, ordered their development. But how was this economically possible? His own treasury was not strong enough to cover it. That is, he needed to generate new income. For this reason, he taxed various tribes for the development of settlements and the maintenance of the buildings or walls around them. The main idea was that these payments would benefit everyone. In this way, the tribes understood that they had to pay to benefit from the opportunities and protection of the state they were a part of. Everyone would benefit from the silver and spoils that would flow into the region with the expansion of the state's borders. In other words, the people understood that the various gains achieved thanks to Rurik could only be obtained through a long-term understanding of unity around common interests. In this way, Rurik laid the foundations of a great state that the Vikings dreamed of establishing in the Slavic lands. However, his life was not long enough to see this structure fully mature. This would be achieved by his successor, Oleg. Around the year 878, Oleg captured Kiev. Kiev was a very important city not only for the region, but also for the Vikings' goals in the Slavic lands. When the Vikings came to the Slavic lands, they didn't just want to stay in the north. They wanted to go south to be close to the trade routes on the Black Sea and the great cities of the Byzantine Empire. They needed a base for their expeditions to the south. Thus, by capturing Kiev, Oleg also realized the dream of his predecessors. The capture of Kiev was such an important event that some sources consider Oleg, not Rurik, to be the founder of the Russian state. Kiev was considered a kind of capital for Oleg and his descendants. After capturing Kiev, Oleg first established superiority over a Slavic tribe called the Drevlians to further increase his power in the region and subjected them to tribute. He invested in the development of Kiev with the taxes he collected from them and other tribes. For him, Kiev was a base to be used in new expeditions, a fountain of wealth where money would constantly flow through trade, and a gate to new victories. Now it was time to seize the trade routes, but there was a problem. The dominance of the Turkic Khazar Khaganate in trade was preventing Oleg from obtaining the profits he desired. The Khazar Khaganate's dominance had to be ended. For this reason, he supported some Slavic tribes and persuaded them to take action against the Khaganate and supported raiding activities against the Khaganate. But these first raiding expeditions ended in failure. Oleg could not defeat his enemy by attack. In contrast, there were other methods that could be applied to break the power of the Khazar Turks in the region. For this reason, he defeated one of the tribes that paid money to the Khaganate on the battlefield and forced them to pay him money regularly. As a result, other tribes also understood that the new power prevailing in the region was Oleg's administration and started paying Oleg the money they normally paid to the Khazar Khaganate. Thus, although Oleg could not eliminate the Khazar Khaganate as he wished, he broke the power of the Khazar Turks in the region by cutting off some of the Khaganate sources of income and influence. Now it was time to expand the state's area of activity in a southwesterly direction. Because the roads and trade routes from Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, passed through here. At that time, Magyars lived southwest of Kiev. The Magyars fought with Oleg for a while, drawing some Slavic tribes to their side to block Oleg's path. However, they later realized that the kingdom in Bulgaria was a very easy target and turned their main attention to defeating the Bulgarians. Although the war initially went badly for the Bulgarians, with the Bulgarians calling the Pechenegs for help, the Magyars suffered a heavy defeat. Realizing that it would now be difficult for them to survive in the lands they lived in and that they were surrounded by enemies, they migrated west. Some sources attribute the Magyars turning towards Bulgaria instead of continuing to fight the Rus to the efforts of Byzantine diplomats. According to this theory, the Byzantine administration, tired of dealing with the Bulgarians, wanted to distract their enemies by persuading the Magyars to fight against the Bulgarians. If this is true, it's quite an ironic situation, because the Magyars ceasing to fight Oleg and turning towards the Bulgarian kingdom would allow Oleg to realize his dreams regarding Byzantium. The westward migration of the Magyars was a turning point for Oleg. There was no longer an obstacle for him on the road to Byzantine lands and the capital, Constantinople. He quickly placed his own merchants in these lands and made attempts to take advantage of the weak situation the Byzantine Empire was in. The Byzantine Empire was a great empire and had to deal with many problems at the same time. The fact that it constantly had to share its resources and forces across the empire's vast borders made it vulnerable to sudden attacks. Oleg saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Perhaps he didn't have a plan to capture and hold Constantinople, but if he could put the Byzantine administration in a difficult position even once, he could persuade them to make very profitable trade agreements and to pay regular tribute. He blockaded Constantinople with his horsemen on land and with warriors placed on many small boats on the sea. He plundered the settlements around the city, trapping the people and rulers inside the city. There was no other way for the Byzantine administrators than to bow to Oleg's demands. Finally, a peace treaty was signed between the two states. The Byzantine side agreed to pay money and sign trade agreements that would benefit the Rus. With this agreement, Oleg had achieved what he wanted. He was now one of the leading leaders of his geography. Money was flowing into his cities from the surrounding trade routes, and his own administration was constantly gaining strength. With Oleg's victory, the foundation of the deep-rooted relations between the Byzantine and Rus administrations was laid. These relations, established as a result of a conflict, played a decisive role for the administrations in the Russian lands for many years, and even after the Byzantine Empire was physically destroyed in 1453, the faith and ideology it represented continued to exert its influence on the Russian lands. During this period, the Rus state, with its center in Kiev, would now witness some of the most important events in its history, dealing not only with local tribes, but also with great empires and kingdoms. Exactly 530 years ago, in October 1492, the Italian navigator Christopher Columbus landed on the Bahamas, off the coast of the American continent. Today, 1492 is considered the year America was discovered, and Christopher Columbus is accepted as its discoverer. But Viking sagas from the 13th century tell stories suggesting that Scandinavians reached America about 500 years before the Spanish voyages of discovery. Furthermore, archaeological studies conducted today confirm the Viking presence in North America. So why do we continue to write in history books or teach in schools that Christopher Columbus was the discoverer of America? You'll have the answer to that question before this video ends. First, let's dive into the dusty pages of the Viking sagas and try to present the magnificent stories about the Vikings' North Atlantic expeditions in an orderly fashion. Actually, the history of Europeans' journeys to America extends back to around the 550s, about 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus's voyages. You find the earliest of these journeys in a medieval record called Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, or The Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. About 300 years before the Vikings' North Atlantic explorations, St. Brendan and Irish monks had set sail westward to search for the Isles of the Blessed, which they believed were located in the Atlantic. Today, it is considered certain that the monks reached the Faroe Islands and Iceland during these voyages. However, it is impossible to determine how much of the story that extends to the shores of North America is true. In the book, you find details about real things like icebergs, volcanoes, and whales. The remaining details seem lost among the lines adorned with the limitless imagination of the saints. After Brendan's voyages, Irish monks visited the Faroe Islands and Iceland many times for seclusion, but since they came in all-male groups, they did not feel the need to establish a permanent settlement. The first to settle here would be communities of Scandinavian origin. The Vikings, who began raiding Britain from the end of the 8th century, came into contact with Irish monks in the early 9th century and learned that there were other islands suitable for settlement in the west. The Irish monk Dicuil writes in his work penned in 825 that the Vikings first settled in the Faroe Islands. Because the islands were full of sheep brought by the monks for food, the Scandinavians named them the Faroe Islands, meaning sheep islands. The Vikings' next stop in the North Atlantic was Iceland. Around the year 860, the ship of a Viking named Nadod, who had set sail from Denmark to go to the Hebrides, was caught in a storm and drifted to an unknown piece of land. With its high cliffs and ice-covered lands, this land did not seem very attractive to Gardar at first. However, the weather conditions were not very suitable for returning. So Gardar and his men landed at Húsavík on the northern coast of the island and wandered around this newly discovered piece of land for a few months. When spring came and they set sail again, they left a slave and a concubine behind. These were the first inhabitants of Iceland. Gardar had named the island after himself, but the one who would give the island its real name was the Norwegian Floki. Floki had met Nadod after he returned to Scandinavia and was impressed by the stories he told. However, his experience when he reached Iceland was not at all what he had imagined. Floki chose the area where the town of Reyðarfjörður is today as his settlement. He spent his first summer here hunting seals, but since he could not obtain enough food, all the animals he brought with him died of starvation. Upon this development, he decided to return, but he was stranded on the island because the fjords leading to the sea were covered with ice. Because of all these experiences, Floki named this place Iceland, meaning land of ice. This word, originating from Old Norse, eventually passed into other languages and is known as Iceland in English. Around the year 874, a group of people having problems with the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair, along with their wives and children, left Norway under the leadership of Ingolfur Arnarsson and came to Iceland. This group's attempt to establish a settlement was successful, and by the middle of the 10th century, the population in Iceland had reached several thousand people. Now that Iceland was discovered, it was only a matter of time before Greenland was discovered as well. In the first quarter of the 10th century, a sailor named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson, while traveling from Norway to Iceland, was caught in a storm, went off course, and was drifted to Greenland, which was covered with huge glaciers west of Iceland. Gunnbjörn did not land on this piece of land, which did not seem very fertile to his eyes, and returned to Iceland. Shortly after this event, a new group came to Iceland to settle. One of the members of this group was Erik Thorvaldsson, who was just a young boy at the time. When he grew up, he would be known as Erik the Red because of his long red hair and red beard. Erik's father had been sent into exile for committing murder, and he had migrated to Iceland with his family, including young Erik. But all the fertile lands here had already been taken by the settlers who had come to the region before. Erik got into many fights to acquire better lands and was eventually exiled from Iceland in 982 for killing one of his rivals. He had to leave the country for at least 3 years. The best thing to do was to sail west, to go to the land discovered by Gunnbjörn years ago and to investigate whether a settlement could be established there. So Erik, with a few men he took with him, set sail and began to advance in the freezing waters of the Atlantic. First reaching the southern tip of Greenland, Erik then headed north and explored the western strip of this land. There was no sign of life in the ice-covered fjords. Every few miles they encountered decayed boat remains. These probably belonged to the Dorset Eskimos, who are thought to have left the region about 100 years earlier. Erik explored Greenland for 3 years, and at the end of the 3rd year his exile period was over, so he returned to Iceland. Actually, Greenland was not a suitable place to live, but Erik named this place Greenland, meaning Greenland, to make his new discovery exciting for people. In the stories he told, he said that the new piece of land he found was full of lush green trees. Soon, hundreds of people hoping to go to Greenland had gathered around him. When Erik set sail again, this time 25 ships accompanied him. However, only 14 of them would manage to land safely. The rest had either turned back or were lost in the dark waters of the Atlantic. Greenland never became as attractive a settlement for the Vikings as Iceland, and it can't be said that even Iceland was a very attractive settlement. In contrast, the descendants of Erik the Red continued to live in Greenland until the 15th century. As a result of archaeological excavations carried out here in the 20th century, the remains of 3 longhouses, a Viking thing, assembly, a forge, and a church left by the Vikings were unearthed. About 4 years after the discovery of Greenland, in 986, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who came to Iceland, learned that his father had abandoned his land here and set sail with Erik the Red to the newly discovered lands. Bjarni immediately gathered his crew and set sail again to find his father and other relatives who had gone with Erik. However, none of them had ever been to Greenland before. They had nothing but a few legendary stories told by Erik in Iceland. Moreover, the journey was much more difficult than they expected. Shortly after Bjarni and his crew set sail, the sky was covered with black clouds and a violent storm broke out, tossing their ship from side to side. After this 3-day storm, the first thing Bjarni and his men saw was a piece of land that could barely be distinguished through the dispersing black clouds. Bjarni sailed north along the coast, and thinking the lands here were worthless, did not bother to land. He also had not found any trace of the new settlement established by Erik. After a journey of several days, Bjarni finally landed in Greenland and managed to reach his father's farm in the eastern settlement. The discovery of new lands in the southwest did not attract much attention at first, but around the year 1000, Erik the Red, impressed by Bjarni's stories, decided that an exploratory journey should be made here. However, he himself was now too old to undertake this arduous and long journey. Therefore, he appointed his son, Leif Erikson, as the leader of the expedition. Preparations were completed, and in the summer of the year 1000, the Vikings set sail for the lands discovered by Bjarni with a team of 35 people. The first place they landed was today's Baffin Island. Leif had named this place Helluland, meaning land of flat stones. But Leif thought it would be a waste of time to linger here. Everywhere they looked, they encountered barren lands. So they got back on their ships and started heading south. They reached a place they named Markland, meaning land of forests, and then Vinland, meaning land of wine. Markland is today's Labrador, but it has not yet been determined exactly where Vinland was. The Vikings landed in this place they called Vinland, and built a few houses to spend the winter. But this was not a permanent settlement. When spring came, Leif returned to Greenland, and the exploration was continued by his brother, Thorvald. Leif and his crew were the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent. Thorvald would be the first European to encounter Native Americans, but this encounter was not very friendly. The Vikings had killed a few skraelings, their term for the natives, at a place where they landed, and the others who gathered to avenge them attacked the Vikings and mortally wounded Thorvald. This development was the end of the Vikings' second expedition. A few years after Thorvald's attempt, a tribal leader named Thorfinn Karlsefni left Greenland to establish a permanent settlement on the shores of Vinland. With him were his wife, Gudrid, and about 70 settlers, most of them men. The first winter Thorfinn and his companions spent in Vinland was quite calm. They had established communication with the Native Americans in the region and had even started fur trading among themselves. However, in time, disagreements began to arise between the two groups. When Thorfinn's men killed a group of natives on the pretext that they were trying to steal their swords, the others came back to take revenge. The Vikings managed to repel the natives by setting an ambush, but they couldn't stay here for long. The next year he returned to Greenland and eventually bought some land in Iceland and settled there. A few years later, the last settlement attempt made by Leif Eriksson's illegitimate sister, Freydis, also failed. From this point on, the Vikings' interest in Vinland began to wane. The fate of the journeys made to North America by a few adventurers later is uncertain. Almost everything you've talked about so far comes from two sagas written down from the 13th century onwards, the Greenlanders saga and the saga of Eric the Red. This situation naturally brings to mind the possibility that all these stories might have been made up. In fact, historians considering this possibility thought for a long time that the Vikings' voyages to Vinland were not real. Until, in 1960, traces belonging to the Vikings were found on the island of Newfoundland, located on the west coast of North America. In 1960, with the efforts of two Norwegian researchers, a Viking settlement was discovered at the northern tip of Newfoundland. As a result of excavation work carried out by archaeologists in the region later, the foundations of 7 longhouses belonging to the Vikings were found near a small village called Lens-aux-Meadows. The foundations of the houses were covered with turf, just like in Greenland and Iceland. Around the settlement, there were various workshops. All the materials found bore the marks of Viking craftsmanship. It was now an indisputable fact that the Vikings had reached America a full 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So why do we still claim today that America was discovered by Christopher Columbus? Is this incorrect information? Actually, it's not. It might be a bit of a cliché, but Columbus was not the first, but the last discoverer of America. Like the Vikings, there were other civilizations thought to have reached America before Columbus. However, all pre-Columbian discoveries suffered the ravages of time. They did not leave a permanent mark on human memory. They were only told in stories, in sagas, and were often forgotten. But Columbus's discovery was permanent. Since that day, it has never been forgotten that there is a huge continent lying beyond the Atlantic Ocean. New settlements were established on this continent, and some of them have managed to survive to this day. That is why today we accept Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America. But this situation does not cast a shadow on the Vikings' voyages to Vinland. On the contrary, these voyages tell us a story of tremendous achievement of how the Vikings reached America 500 years before Columbus, using the islands in the North Atlantic almost like a stepping stone. And when you consider how limited their means and technology were compared to 500 years later, the value and importance of these achievements become even more understandable. From the late 8th century onwards, England had to face relentless attacks. Warriors from the northeast spread terror along England's coasts. These attacks eventually spread throughout Europe and changed the course of world history. Historians would later name this period the Viking Age. During this era, many Viking leaders made their names known across Europe, becoming figures that haunted the nightmares of kings. But none of these Viking leaders ever possessed as much power as Cnut, nor could they expand their sphere of influence as widely as he did. Cnut was born in Scandinavia around the year 990. His father was the Danish Prince Sweyn Forkbeard, and his grandfather was King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. Bluetooth was the first king in Scandinavia to accept Christianity. Following his adoption of Christianity, the religion began to rise in Scandinavia, and Cnut was raised as a Christian. Although the Vikings had embraced Christianity, this did not stop their raids on other Christian countries. In the years Cnut was born, England in particular had become very weak in the face of continuous Viking raids. The English throne was occupied by Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred's rule was never truly stable, but an order he gave in 1002 would trigger a series of events that would profoundly change English history. The king ordered the killing of all Danish men residing in England. This event went down in history as the St. Brice's Day massacre, named after the day it was carried out. Cnut's fate was closely linked to this event. His father, Sweyn, launched raids on England in 1003 and 1004 to avenge the massacre of the Danes. A great deal of plunder was obtained in these raids, but no lasting result was achieved. After a gap of 9 years, Sweyn landed again near the coast of Kent in 1013. This time his son Cnut, in his early 20s, accompanied him. The purpose of the expedition was quite different from the previous one. Sweyn was not interested in plundering and obtaining loot. His main goal was to seize the English throne. After landing in Kent, his first move was to advance to the north of the country, where he won over many nobles who were dissatisfied with Ethelred's rule. He then marched south and besieged the capital, London. Ethelred initially tried to defend the city, but after a while he realized he could not succeed. The King of England had no choice but to flee the country. For this purpose, he first sent his sons, Edward and Alfred, to the Duchy of Normandy, ruled by his brother-in-law Richard II. Then he himself left England and fled to Normandy. After Ethelred's departure from the city, Sweyn captured London and became the new King of England. However, he would not be able to enjoy his success for long. Just 5 weeks after ascending the throne, on February 3, 1014, he passed away. Under normal circumstances, his son Cnut should have ascended his throne and become the King of England. But things did not go as Cnut had hoped. Following Sweyn's death, the English nobles made a deal with Ethelred in Normandy, informing him that they would recognize him as King of England in exchange for certain conditions. These conditions included Ethelred declaring his loyalty to the nobles, making reforms on issues the nobles were unhappy with, and forgiving the betrayals committed against him during his previous reign. Ethelred accepted this offer and left Normandy, landing in the south of England. Shortly thereafter, the English nobles swore allegiance to him as promised. Thus, Ethelred once again became King of England. But being declared king was not enough for him to sit securely on his throne. Sweyn's son Cnut was still in England. To secure his throne, Ethelred had to defeat him. For this purpose, the king immediately marched on Cnut. The Viking chief did not have the military strength to stand against him. Therefore, he had to board ships with his soldiers and leave England, returning to Denmark. Cnut had lost both his father and the English lands he had inherited from him. But he had no intention of accepting this loss. He would not easily give up the English throne they had captured with his father. Upon arriving in Denmark, he gathered a large army for a new expedition with the help of his brother, Harold II. Sometime later, when he left Denmark, he had 8,000 soldiers and 200 ships to carry them under his command. On top of all this, when he landed in Wessex in the summer of 1015, the chaos and instability reigning in England were the first signs that the wind was changing direction. King Ethelred had promised to forgive the nobles who had betrayed him before he ascended the throne. However, after taking the throne, he had 2 brothers, Sigurfurth and Morcar, who had supported Sweyn by betraying him, killed. He had ordered Sigurfurth's wife, Ealdgith, to be confined to a monastery. But Ethelred's son, Edmund, prevented his father's order from being carried out and married Sigurfurth's wife, Ealdgith. In this way, he took over the administration of the 5 boroughs, the lands of the murdered brothers. This situation, of course, attracted everyone's attention and caused unrest. When the king fell seriously ill shortly after this incident, he could not find the opportunity to correct the situation in his country. With England in such a state, Cnut's landing was a harbinger of things getting even worse for Ethelred. Ethelred's son-in-law and the ruler of Mercia, Edric Streona, thought that Cnut would easily seize the English throne in such a difficult time. He decided that it would be to his advantage to be on the winning side. First, taking advantage of the king's illness, he gathered an army in his name. Then he took 40 ships from the royal fleet and fled with his soldiers to Cnut's side, entering his service. With these reinforcements, the size of Cnut's army had increased significantly. Without wasting time, the Viking chief moved towards the northern lands, which he saw as an easy target. His aim was first to eliminate Edmund, and then to march on the sick king Ethelred. During this process, Edmund managed to form an army with the help of his wife's influence in the region. However, the soldiers in the established army did not want to defy the authority of their king, Ethelred. Therefore, they would not fight before the king arrived or sent an order. In this situation, Edmund made an agreement with his father, Ethelred, and persuaded him to lead the army. However, Ethelred soon returned to London, both because of his illness and because he suspected he would be betrayed by his son. After this incident, the soldiers refused to enter Edmund's command. Thus, the war was not won before it even began. While this was happening on Ethelred's side, Cnut advanced north and captured most of Northumbria. including York. Although Edmund tried to gather a new army during this period, he could not assemble a force large enough to face Cnut. By April 1016, King Ethelred could no longer withstand his debilitating illness and died. Following the king's death, Edmund was chosen as the new King of England by the English nobles and went to London for his coronation. This change on the English throne forced Cnut to act quickly. To prevent Edmund from gathering his strength, he immediately advanced south and besieged London. As Cnut had predicted, Edmund did not have enough soldiers to defend the city. Therefore, he fled the city to gather more soldiers and return. Cnut did not want to allow this, but he also did not want to lift the siege of London. So he divided his army in two, ordering one part of the army to follow Edmund, while he himself continued the siege. In the battles between the Danish army and the English army under Edmund's command, neither army could establish superiority over the other. The Danish army returned to avoid further losses and joined the siege of London. Meanwhile, Cnut continued the siege of London, but he did not have siege weapons to help him capture the city, and London had put up a better resistance than he expected. On the other hand, Edmund did not want to delay any longer. He could not allow London to fall. Finally, he decided that he had gathered enough soldiers and set out to prevent the siege reaching London. Upon hearing the news of Edmund's approach, Cnut lifted the siege to meet him and crossed to the south of the River Thames with his army. Thereupon, Edmund ordered his soldiers to follow the Danish army. The two armies faced each other near Brentford. Edmund and his soldiers managed to defeat the Danish army in this battle. After this defeat, Edric Striona, who was with Cnut, betrayed Cnut, just as he had betrayed Ethelred, and joined Edmund with his men. Edmund did not trust Edric, but his support was of vital importance for the course of the war. Therefore, he had to accept Edric's support. With this betrayal, the size of Cnut's army had decreased significantly. In addition, the lack of provisions and the soldiers being tired from the long campaign made Cnut worried about the course of the war. He had not been able to capture London when he had the chance. Moreover, the English had gained numerical superiority with the soldiers gathered from Wessex and Edric's change of sides. Realizing that he could not win in this situation, Cnut decided to accept defeat and return to Scandinavia. He first advanced north and plundered the lands of Mercia to secure provisions for his soldiers. Then he ordered his army to advance eastward to reach the ships, but Edmund would not let Cnut escape. His father had let Cnut slip through his fingers, and Cnut had returned the next year with soldiers he had gathered from Scandinavia. If he managed to escape now, the same situation could happen again. To prevent this, he ordered his army to advance northward. On October 18, 1016, the two armies faced each other near the village of Assandun. Edmund and his soldiers had managed to get between the Danish army and the ships. This way, Cnut could not board the ships and escape. He would have to fight Edmund. If they did not fight and retreated, the English would capture the Danish fleet and trap them on the island. In addition to his numerical superiority, Edmund had also gained the advantage of positioning his army on a hill, and he believed these factors would bring him victory. Cnut was also aware of the English numerical superiority. In addition, his army was quite worn out, and the morale of the soldiers was very low after successive defeats. But Cnut and his soldiers had no choice but to win this battle. If they lost the battle or retreated, they would be trapped in England and eventually be killed by Edmund. For this reason, whatever the outcome, they had no choice but to fight the English. Cnut, after putting his army in battle formation, ordered his soldiers to advance on the English positioned on the hill. In response, Edmund brought his archers forward and opened fire on the Danish soldiers. This rain of arrows had worn out the Danes considerably and caused their formation to break. This time Edmund ordered his soldiers to launch an all-out attack. He thought that the work of Cnut and his army was now completely finished. The English soldiers descended from the hill and launched an attack against the Danish soldiers. But contrary to Edmund's prediction, the Danes put up a very good resistance against this attack. The reason for this was perhaps that they knew what would happen if they could not win the battle. With this awareness, they were acting in harmony with each other and showing extraordinary effort. But they faced a reality. The English army was numerically superior, and this superiority gave them a great advantage. The Danish soldiers managed to hold their lines for a few hours, but after a while they began to show signs of breaking under the pressure of the English soldiers. The Saxons, taking advantage of this opportunity, entered the gaps opened among the Danish soldiers and forced them to retreat. It now seemed like it was only a matter of time before Edmund and his soldiers won the battle. Just then, something unexpected happened. Edric Striona betrayed the English once again and withdrew from the battlefield with his soldiers. This move caused the English army to lose its biggest advantage, numerical superiority. In addition, the English soldiers largely lost their morale after the betrayal that occurred at a critical moment. Edmund tried to take control of the situation by giving encouraging speeches to his army, but his panicking soldiers could not manage to maintain order. The courage of the Danes, who witnessed the betrayal in Edmund's army, was restored. In this way, they soon began to break through the English lines and push them back. The tide of the battle had suddenly turned, and the English army began to melt away rapidly in the face of the Danish army. Edmund, who could not get his army in order no matter how hard he tried, was finally forced to leave the battlefield with the soldiers he could take with him. Most of the Anglo-Saxons on the battlefield were not as lucky as Edmund. Many Saxon nobles and soldiers could not escape from the battlefield and were killed by the Danish soldiers. The winning side of the battle was Cnut, but the size of the Danish army had been greatly reduced, and the soldiers had no strength left to enter a new battle. Cnut, knowing the state of his army, decided to start negotiations with Edmund instead of continuing the war. In the agreement made between the two sides, the River Thames was determined as the border. The north of the river came under Cnut's administration, while the lands to the south remained under Edmund's rule. Thus England was divided into two separate parts. Just 1 month after this agreement came into effect, on November 30th, 1016, Edmund died, probably due to wounds he received during the battle or an illness he contracted. The English nobles knew that Cnut would want to seize the southern lands after Edmund's death. They did not want the country to be dragged into a new chaos, and they also wanted to protect their positions. For this purpose, instead of putting forward one of their own, they chose Cnut as the king of southern England. Thus, in December 1016, all of England came under Cnut's rule. Cnut was aware that his power would not be permanent unless he eliminated all threats against him. He had lost his throne once after his father's death and had no intention of losing it again. For this purpose, he first had some English nobles whose loyalty he doubted executed. Then he had Ethelred's son, Edwig, killed. Ethelred's sons with Emma of Normandy, Edward and Alfred, fled to Normandy and came under the protection of their relatives there. This situation was a great threat to Cnut's throne. Ethelred's sons could claim the English throne with the support of their uncle, Duke Richard II of Normandy. This threat could only be resolved through diplomatic means, and Cnut decided to solve this problem in this way. In 1017 he married Emma, the sister of Duke Richard of Normandy, and promised Richard that the children born of this marriage would be the heirs to the English throne. Thus he not only prevented threats that could come from Normandy, but also gained a powerful ally. In the same year, he had Edric Striona, who had betrayed him and the English several times, executed, thus eliminating another threat to his throne. By 1018, with the death of his brother Harold, the Danish throne also fell to Cnut. Cnut, who was a landless king who had lost his throne just 3 years earlier, had now become the ruler of the great North Sea Empire, which included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. During his approximately 20-year reign, Cnut prevented the Vikings, most of whom were under his own rule, from raiding England and restored the prosperity that had been disrupted in the country due to Viking raids. The English, who had been subjected to constant plundering of their lands by the Vikings, would not face any external threat during Cnut's reign. Thus, the Vikings, who had created chaos, had become the saviors who rescued the country from the chaos they themselves had created under Cnut's leadership. Around the year 1170, on the Orkney Islands north of Britain, there lived a tribal chief named Svein Aslifarson. From Scotland to Wales, from the Hebrides to Iceland, Svein had become a legend. During his years-long career, he and his men launched hundreds of raids on Britain's large and small islands, plundered dozens of monasteries. In his enemies' records, he was depicted as a monster who knew nothing but killing. But the Orkneyinga saga, written by Vikings in the 13th century, tells of a completely different Svein. Not just a man busy with fighting, plundering, and killing. Let's take a brief look at his life. Because in a way it's your life. For you, the winter months are quite calm. For a few weeks, while Orkney is besieged by cold and ice, you stay at your home in Gersay and rest. You have about 80 men. You have fun with them, you eat, you drink, you enjoy the time spent in your homeland. Your drinking hall is larger and more magnificent than any other hall in Orkney. When spring arrives, your work intensifies. There are plenty of seeds in the barn waiting to be sown. You spend the first days of March with your family planting these seeds. Finally, when all the seeds are sown and your work with the land is done, you and your men launch raids on the Hebrides off the coast of Scotland or on Ireland. You seize a lot of loot and return home towards the middle of summer with your ships full. The Vikings called this the spring voyage. After you return, your first job is to harvest the crops and store the grains. After the harvest is completely stored, you join the autumn raiding season and only have the chance to return home after the first month of winter. This second journey was called the autumn voyage. This whole cycle is like a brief summary of how Scandinavians spent their lives throughout the Viking Age. You are a northern raider who loves to fight. You are seen as a bloodthirsty barbarian by your enemies, but when you return home, you are a hard-working farmer, a respected leader who knows how to have fun with his men and a devoted family man. Your life is much more monotonous, much calmer than that of just a warrior. So what is your place in Viking society? What are the expectations of your men and family from you? Or conversely, what do you expect from your men? To find the answers to these questions, and to understand the Vikings' perspective on daily life, you first need to look at the social structure of Viking society. This structure contains many clues about the Viking social life. In Viking society, social status varied according to the circumstances. In the raids organized on Britain or Western Europe, every warrior was considered equal and received an equal share of the loot. But the situation was different in their own country. In Scandinavia, society was organized in a multi-layered pyramid. At the top of the pyramid was the king who ruled the country. Immediately below him was the noble class called Jarls, which you belonged to. The middle part of the pyramid consisted of the majority of society, the free people, the class called Carls or Bondi. At the very bottom of society were the thralls, slaves and captives, whom the Vikings considered almost equal to animals. The king at the top of the social pyramid was actually a member of the Jarl class. Although they were not very powerful in the early Viking Age, from the 10th century onwards, kings became an important power factor in the Viking world. A Viking king had certain responsibilities towards his people. The Vikings had a reputation as fierce warriors, but they were also the best merchants of their time. The main way to ensure prosperity in Viking society was trade. Therefore, ensuring security in the country, taking initiatives to keep trade alive, and taking measures to protect trade routes from attacks were among the king's main duties. But these were not enough to be a good and respected king. The king had to be generous. He was expected to be generous with food, drink, entertainment, various clothes, weapons, and gifts, and also to protect the honor of his people against their enemies. A king who provided these for his people was considered a good king. The king's wealth increased largely through conquests and the cultivation of royal lands managed by royal representatives. In addition, customs revenues and taxes were also important sources of income. The king used a large part of the income he obtained to finance his army, called the Hird, which consisted of professional soldiers. The feeding and housing costs of the Hird were quite high. In return, it was necessary to keep the ambitious Jarls in the country under control. Because throughout the Viking Age, Jarls and Bondi generally opposed the rule of kings. On the next step down the pyramid were the Jarls, who constituted the aristocratic class of the Vikings. Almost all of them had large lands rented by tenant farmers. They obtained a large part of their income from these lands. The Jarls, just like the kings, had responsibilities towards the people living on their lands. The people saw them as their spiritual and military leaders. The Jarl was obliged to feed them, provide shelter, and protect them against their enemies. In peacetime, he spent his days inspecting his lands with his assistants and checking on the maintenance of his properties, ships, and weapons. When wartime came, he was responsible for recruiting soldiers and commanding these soldiers. The majority of society was composed of the bondi, who were in the middle of the pyramid. The middle class, called Karl or bondi, formed the backbone of Viking society. In peacetime, they appear as farmers, merchants, and blacksmiths. When it was time for an expedition, they put on their axes and shields and became warriors ready to set sail. They were the free men of Viking society. A large part of this class consisted of small landowners. A free man on a small farm with his family and 3 to 4 slaves would work the land, carve wood, herd animals, and produce small items that would be useful in his daily life in his small workshop. The easiest way to obtain items that could not be produced in such small workshops was through barter. Therefore, every Viking was engaged in trade, even on a small scale. As in almost all medieval societies, the Vikings benefited from slaves to meet the heavy labor force. Slaves were at the lowest level of Viking society. They could be easily distinguished from the rest of society by their cut hair, unkempt appearance, and worn-out clothes. Slaves were generally used for heavy work such as cutting trees, digging pits, daily housework, construction, portering, and cleaning manure. They also had a significant share in the Vikings' acquisition of considerable wealth. The Vikings had established a vast slave trade network, stretching from Russia to Ireland. A large part of the slaves consisted of prisoners of war. The main way to obtain their freedom was death. However, in some exceptional cases, slaves were able to collect enough money to buy their freedom. Of course, the latter was valid for slaves who had a merciful master, because most free Vikings did not leave slaves time to work to earn money. In the Viking Age, daily life varied according to the social class one belonged to or the profession one practiced. The life of a fisherman living on the coast of a sea, river, or lake was generally spent on a small boat. For a blacksmith, the workshop was the most important part of daily life. The life of a Viking engaged in trade was spent on long journeys from city to city, from town to town. For the farmers, who constituted the majority of Viking society, life was almost synonymous with the field. Despite all this diversity, the daily activities, culture, beliefs, and behaviors of the Vikings were similar to each other. The center of Viking daily life was the longhouse, seen throughout Scandinavia. These houses were generally built of wood, but since it was difficult to find timber in the northern regions of Norway and the North Atlantic colonies, stone was mostly used in the construction of houses in this region. In a Viking house, the day started early. Slaves would get up before dawn, prepare the fire for the oven, and knead the dough. The most preferred foods for breakfast were porridge, oatcakes, milk, cold fruit, and bread. The man would leave the house early in the morning to go to the field or the workshop, leaving the keys of the house to his wife. When the man was not at home, the head of the house was the woman. She supervised the slaves who carried out the housework throughout the day, sewed clothes for her family, and made sails for the ships that would set out during the expedition season with the slaves. When they were not fighting, Viking men were responsible for plowing the fields, sowing the seeds, and irrigation. Fertilizing was usually left to the slaves. When harvest time came, all the slaves and family members were needed in the field. Everyone had to work in harmony to store the products as soon as possible. The main meal after breakfast was the dinner eaten after the men returned from the field or the workshop. On the table of a rich farmer like Svein, there were all kinds of meat, as well as stews, porridge, sausages, fish, and mushrooms. Meals were eaten from wooden bowls. Beer brewed from hops was the most popular drink of the Viking Age. Wine, however, was consumed only by rich Vikings. Throughout the Viking Age, one of the most striking features of the Vikings was that they established very active trade networks stretching from Scandinavia to Europe and the Mediterranean. This trade, especially from the 10th century onwards, led to the enormous development of Viking towns in the Baltic region, such as Ribe, Kaupang, Hedeby, and Birka. This development soon spread to Viking settlements in Russia and Europe. For example, the Vikings under the leadership of Rollo, who settled in the Normandy region in 911, had turned the city of Rouen, which had been attacked for years, and had lost a large part of its population, into a trade center again. The main medium of exchange in trade was determined as silver. A large amount of silver cut into rods has been found in archaeological excavations in Scandinavia. Merchants carried small scales to weigh them correctly. However, silver was not the only medium of exchange. Another common method of exchange used in trade was barter. The development of trade undoubtedly created some changes in the daily lives of the Vikings. However, this change was reflected more in the life of the merchant than the farmer. Farm life was static. In contrast, city and town life was much more dynamic. Markets, fairs, and festivals were the most important part of Viking daily life in the cities. Especially in regions where trade was common, people from many different cultures came together in the markets, both trading and exchanging cultures. This cultural exchange was also one of the main factors that led to the mass conversion of the Vikings to another religion in the 12th and 13th centuries. Historians call the period in Europe from the end of the 8th century to the middle of the 11th century the Viking Age. During this period, the Vikings launched raids on various parts of Europe, especially England and France, and became the nightmare of the people. This period of turmoil also brought with it an important consequence. The interaction of the Vikings with Christians increased as never before, and as a result, by the 12th century, almost all of Scandinavia had become Christian. Thus the Vikings, who previously had no hesitation in plundering religious places such as monasteries and churches, gradually abandoned these habits, and by the 12th century the period called the Viking Age came to an end. So how did the Vikings become Christian? What conditions led the Vikings to abandon their old pagan beliefs and adopt Christianity? Before you learn this, let's first take a look at the Vikings' beliefs before Christianity. Norse paganism. In Norse paganism, belief in the existence of multiple gods such as Loki, Thor, and Frigg was common. Odin was considered the greatest of these gods. Worship consisted of sacrifices offered to the gods and reverence for ancestral spirits. There was no need for the presence of priests or religious officials to perform religious rituals. The rituals performed by the Vikings were not very similar to the rituals performed in Christianity. In this respect, the old Scandinavian faith had quite different traditions and practices compared to Christianity. Before the period called the Viking Age, Scandinavian merchants traded with different communities in Europe. In this way, the interaction between pagan Scandinavians and Christian societies increased, and the Scandinavians were introduced to the Christian faith. However, some Christian societies did not prefer to trade much with the pagan Scandinavians. Problems such as the decrease in trade and therefore wealth and the infertility of agricultural lands in Scandinavia pushed the Vikings to plunder overseas lands, and thus the period called the Viking Age began. Historians point to the year 793 for the beginning of this period. In this year, the monastery of St. Cuthbert on the island of Lindisfarne, located in the east of England, was plundered by the Vikings. In this attack, the Scandinavian warriors obtained enormous loot without facing great resistance. They returned to Scandinavia with the loot they obtained and the monks they took captive to sell as slaves. Before this attack, since there were no attacks on monasteries in lands where Christianity was adopted, like England, these structures were built defenseless against attacks and were not protected by any military force. However, since the Viking warriors were not Christians, plundering structures like monasteries and churches was not a deterrent for them. On the contrary, since the loot here was not well protected, raiding activities became very attractive for Viking leaders and warriors. During this period, the Danes in particular interacted with the Christian Germanic communities living south of Denmark. These lands were Christianized during the reign of the Frankish king Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th centuries. However, the interaction was limited and was not enough for the Scandinavians to lean towards the Christian faith. But a succession struggle that emerged in Denmark in 812 would cause this situation to change. In 812, after the death of Hemming, one of the local kings of Denmark, a civil war broke out among the heirs to the throne. A Danish noble named Harald Klak went to the court of Louis the Pious, the son of the Frankish king Charlemagne, in 814 and requested help to seize the throne left by Hemming. Louis accepted this request for help. Harald, who also got the support of Louis, managed to ascend the throne in 819. After ascending the throne, he and his family were baptized and became Christian. Many Viking nobles also followed him and became Christian in the same way. After this event, the way was opened for missionary activities to be carried out in Denmark. With Harald's special permission, Archbishop Ebbo of Rams came to Denmark and carried out missionary activities in various parts of the country. However, these activities did not achieve sufficient success at first. By 831, a Frankish missionary named Ansgar was appointed Archbishop of Hamburg by Pope Gregory and was tasked with inviting the Scandinavians to the Christian faith. For this purpose, Ansgar went to the city of Birka in Sweden and carried out various missionary activities there. His initiative was partially successful, and Ansgar managed to establish a small Christian community in Birka. However, this initiative would be interrupted by the plundering of Hamburg by the Vikings in 845. After the plundering of Hamburg, Ansgar was appointed archbishop in the city of Bremen, which was located further south and was not a target of Viking attacks because it was not a coastal city, and he did not play a significant role in the Christianization of Scandinavia for the rest of his life. He died in Bremen in 865. The adoption of Christianity by the Vikings could also occur as a result of political reasons, such as gaining allies or peace agreements made between parties. An example of this is the Treaty of Wedmore, signed between the Danish Viking leader Guthrum and King Alfred of Wessex. In the Battle of Edington in 878, Guthrum was defeated by the English King Alfred. With the Treaty of Wedmore signed after this defeat, Guthrum was baptized and took the name Ethelstan. In return, Alfred granted him the right to rule the lands of East Anglia, and Guthrum lived as a Christian until his death in 890. A similar agreement was also made between the first Duke of Normandy, Rollo, and the King of France, Charles the Simple. In other words, such conversion attempts for the sake of interests were quite common in this period. It is thought that Harald Bluetooth, who is considered the first king to unite all of Denmark and rule the country from a single hand, may also have adopted Christianity for political reasons. In fact, Harald Bluetooth's conversion to Christianity is told in different ways in historical records. According to the 10th century historian Widukind, Harald was baptized and became a Christian by a priest named Poppo. Poppo had managed to carry a red-hot iron without burning his hand, and Harald, impressed by this event, decided that Christianity was the true religion and accepted Christianity. In the work written by the historian Adam of Bremen and completed in 1076, Gesta Hammerbergensis Ecclesiae Pontificum, it is told that Harald became a Christian after being defeated in a war with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II. In a saga written by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, it is told that Harald was forced to convert and become a Christian as a result of pressure from the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II. So the general view of historians on this matter is that the reason for Harald's choice of Christianity was political. However, whether this conversion occurred after a defeat against the Holy Roman emperors or as a result of various pressures is uncertain due to the lack of sources. After Harald adopted Christianity, Christianity began to spread in Denmark, and this spread soon spread to other Scandinavian countries such as Norway and Sweden. One of the Viking kings who became Christian was the Norwegian king Olaf, who lived in the 10th century. Olaf had become a Christian during an expedition he organized to England in 994. Olaf, the first Christian king of Norway, decided to spread his new faith throughout the country when he returned to his country. However, his attempts to spread Christianity were not very peaceful. Many Norwegians who insisted on not abandoning paganism were killed, subjected to various tortures, or sent into exile. In addition, pagan temples were destroyed throughout the country, and churches were built in their place. The Norwegians could only escape Olaf's wrath by accepting Christianity or pretending to have accepted it. Olaf also wanted to spread Christianity in the Viking colonies established in Iceland and Greenland. For this purpose, he first sent missionaries to Iceland. However, these missionaries were not successful in attracting the interest of the Icelanders. Thereupon, Olaf resorted to making people Christian by force in Iceland, just as in Norway. In this direction, he took the Icelanders who were in Norway at that time as captives and banned the Icelanders from trading with merchants in Norway. In those years, Iceland was largely dependent on Norway, and the ban on trade with Norway was a big problem for the Icelanders. In addition, many Icelanders' relatives were also held captive by Olaf. In the face of all these events, the Icelanders had to agree to accept Christianity. In Greenland, this process was slower compared to Iceland and occurred on a voluntary basis. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, who went to Greenland at the end of the 10th century and established a Viking colony there, visited Norway around the year 1000. Leif, who met with King Olaf during this visit, was baptized and became a Christian at Olaf's request. Olaf thought he could use Leif to Christianize Greenland. In this direction, he gave him the task of spreading Christianity in Greenland. Leif also accepted this task and returned to Greenland accompanied by a priest, and thus the process of the spread of Christianity in Greenland began. The last kingdom to accept Christianity in Scandinavia was Sweden. From the 9th century onwards, missionaries from various places continued their activities in Sweden. However, these missionary efforts did not yield a permanent result. Olof, the first Christian king of Sweden, was baptized and became a Christian by a bishop sent by Archbishop Bruno of Querfurt at the beginning of the 10th century. Olof, unlike the Norwegian king Olaf, did not prefer to spread Christianity by force. However, despite this, his power and influence throughout the country greatly accelerated the spread of Christianity in Sweden. The fact that Christianity became the dominant religion in all of Scandinavia, including Sweden, occurred during the time of Cnut the Great. By the first quarter of the 11th century, Cnut the Great, the grandson of Harald Bluetooth, had established a great state covering England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Knut attached great importance to the spread of Christianity. For this purpose, he had churches built in various parts of Scandinavia and supported missionary activities. Knut's efforts to spread Christianity were carried out through more peaceful means, like his grandfather Harald. In this way, the people in Scandinavia who had not yet adopted Christianity also became Christian. As you can see, Christianity in Scandinavia mostly occurred from the top of the social pyramid downwards. When a king became a Christian for various political and personal reasons, the nobles of the country also became Christian to protect their positions, and then the subjects of the nobles also adopted Christianity. Thus, a transition process to Christianity, which was mostly focused on personal interests from top to bottom, was experienced, and with its effect, paganism and Christian teachings were intertwined for a long time. For example, a person who adopted Christianity for various reasons could offer sacrifices to their old gods to avoid angering them, and could continue to practice various rituals from paganism. According to one of the Scandinavian sagas, the Hervarar saga, the Swedish king Inge had made efforts to end the sacrifices and pagan rituals dedicated to the old gods, but as a result of the reaction against him throughout the country, he had to abdicate the throne and leave Sweden. However, despite all this, in the time that passed until the 12th century, Christianity was almost completely adopted in Scandinavia, and rituals from paganism began to be largely abandoned. Various Viking communities that settled in places outside of Scandinavia, such as France, Britain, and Russia, had also adopted Christianity by this date. These religious changes had occurred as a result of missionary activities and interaction between cultures or various political reasons. The Vikings. They were the cold-blooded warriors of Scandinavia, passionate explorers and merchants who knew no borders. From America to Asia, from the most remote islands to Africa, it is possible to find their traces in many parts of the world. The period from the end of the 8th century to the middle of the 11th century is called the Viking Age by historians, in reference to the Vikings' effects in Europe. The series Vikings, which started in 2013 and lasted until 2020, takes the period from the beginning of this era as its subject. Frankly, this series is a production that I also watched with great pleasure. However, such series and films based on historical events inevitably lead to some questions in the minds of the audience. How real were the events depicted in the series? To what extent were the Vikings really involved in the events told throughout the series? Were the characters created correctly, or was there distortion in the events? Frankly, learning the truth of the events in such a long-running series requires deep research. In this video, we tried to answer these questions. Let's see how well the main events in the Vikings series overlap with historical facts. Let's start our examination with the most important character of the series, Ragnar. In the series, Ragnar is portrayed as an ordinary farmer with great ambitions and goals. He lives a happy life with his wife, Lagertha, and his son, Bjorn. Like many farmer Vikings, he takes care of his crops and participates in the raids on the Baltic coasts in the spring of every year. The city where Ragnar and his family live, Kattegat, is ruled by a noble named Earl Haraldsson. So what kind of life did Ragnar really lead? We have prepared a video about Ragnar Lothbrok before and touched on the details of the subject in that video. However, it will be useful to refresh our knowledge here as well. First of all, let's state this. The sources about Ragnar are quite limited. We learn about his life mostly from the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, written in Icelandic in the 13th century. Most of the events known about Ragnar today and depicted in the series are from the stories told in this and other Scandinavian sagas. In these stories, Ragnar's life is fictionalized. Let's compare the information in the series with historical records. In the series, Lagertha is shown as Ragnar's wife. However, Scandinavian sagas do not mention that he had a wife named Lagertha. The name Lagertha only appears in a 12th century Danish history, the Gesta Danorum. The information obtained from here is also very limited. Naturally, this situation causes many historians to approach the historical reality of Lagertha with suspicion. Even if we assume that the series took the Gesta Danorum as a source, we can say that the information given about Lagertha does not match what is told here. Yes, we learn from the Gesta Danorum that Lagertha was Ragnar's wife, but the information that Bjorn was Lagertha's son is not given here. According to various Scandinavian sagas, Bjorn was the son of Aslaug, not Lagertha, and unlike what is shown in the series, his mother was the same as Ivar, Fitzurk, and Sigurd. At this point, we must say that the screenwriters created new family ties for Ragnar. Another issue is that Ragnar is portrayed as an ordinary farmer in the series. In reality, the situation was quite different. In the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the Gesta Danorum, it is stated that Ragnar was the son of the legendary Swedish king Sigurd Ring. Accordingly, Ragnar was not an ordinary farmer with great ambitions, but a noble king. Instead of telling the story of a king in the series, a portrait of an ordinary person with big dreams was created for Ragnar, with whom the audience can empathize. Thanks to this choice, the audience both witnesses Ragnar's rise and can easily empathize with Ragnar in his actions. In this respect, although the Ragnar portrait created in the series looks good in terms of viewing pleasure, it does not reflect the truth from a historical point of view. So what about his actions? How real are they? Now let's analyze them a bit. In the first episodes of the series, Ragnar sets sail with the men he has gathered without the Earl's knowledge. After a long sea voyage full of obstacles, he arrives at the shores of England. Then he and his men plunder a monastery they encounter and set sail again, returning to Kattegat in Scandinavia. In reality, such a Viking attack on the monastery of St. Cuthbert on the island of Lindisfarne was actually carried out. The Vikings had killed a large part of the monks in the monastery and taken some of them captive to Scandinavia. The Vikings, who obtained a great deal of loot in this attack, would later frequently organize attacks on the island to obtain loot and land. In fact, the Lindisfarne raid would later be considered the beginning of the Viking Age. However, although the existence of the attack is real, we cannot find any historical record that this attack was carried out under the leadership of Ragnar. Moreover, it is not clear which Viking leaders commanded the Lindisfarne raid. In the series, we watch a scenario where this attack is organized by Ragnar. In this respect, we can think that the series is trying to fill a gap in the historical records. However, in the following episodes, we also witness Ragnar besieging Paris. While the Lindisfarne attack took place in 793, the first Viking siege of Paris took place in 845. In this respect, it is a very low probability that Ragnar both organized the attack on the monastery in Lindisfarne, which is considered the beginning of the Viking Age, and was present at the siege of Paris. Even in the most likely case, if we accept Ragnar as a 25-30-year-old Viking leader in Lindisfarne, He would have to be an 80-year-old man during the Paris raid. This is an exaggerated number for the period the Vikings lived in. Also, the fact that this event was overlooked in the Viking sagas almost reduces the probability of Ragnar being in Lindisfarne to zero. Now let's examine another iconic scene of the series. In the third season, Ragnar besieges Paris with the soldiers under his command. In this long siege, the city cannot be captured. Ragnar makes a plan to enter the city. According to the plan, he first gets baptized, saying that he has become a Christian. Then he pretends to be dead. His son Bjorn informs Emperor Charles that if a funeral ceremony suitable for a Christian is not held for Ragnar, he will not lift the siege. Charles accepts this request to lift the siege. Then Ragnar enters the city in a coffin with some Viking warriors. During the funeral ceremony, he comes out of the coffin, takes the king's daughter, Princess Gisla, hostage, and in this way opens the city gates to the Vikings. In this way, Paris is easily captured and plundered. And after this, the Viking army leaves Ragnar's brother, Rollo, behind to ensure the security of Scandinavia. But Rollo makes a deal with Emperor Charles and agrees to enter his service and defend the northern borders of his country against the Vikings, on the condition that the Duchy of Normandy is given to him. When Ragnar and the Vikings under his command return to the region, they learn that Rollo has betrayed them. In the ensuing battle, Rollo is victorious, and the Vikings under Ragnar's command are defeated. So what really happened in Scandinavia? According to Frankish records, in 845 a Viking leader named Ragnar advanced along the Seine River with 120 ships and more than 4,000 soldiers, besieged Paris, and lifted the siege in exchange for a certain amount of ransom, returning to Scandinavia. Historians think that this Viking leader, referred to as Ragnar in the Frankish records, could be Ragnar. However, the information that Rollo took part in this siege alongside Ragnar is not correct. Rollo was either just a baby or had not even been born when Ragnar organized the siege of Paris. Rollo was actually one of the Viking leaders who participated in the siege of Paris organized by a Viking leader named Sigfrid in 885. When this siege was unsuccessful, Sigfrid left the region. However, Rollo continued the siege despite this and withdrew in exchange for a ransom. On his way back, he advanced along the Seine River with his soldiers and plundered northern France, which is known as Normandy today. In the spring of 886, he besieged Paris again, with the Vikings under his command. However, this siege was unsuccessful, and Rollo was defeated by the Frankish army. Emperor Charles III had managed to defeat Rollo, but he had some plans for him. He wanted to stop the constant Viking raids from the Seine River. At this point, it would be wise to make brother fight brother. He made a deal with Rollo, and, in exchange for his becoming a Christian, he gave him a large part of northwestern France, which is called Normandy today, with an agreement. In this respect, the information that Rollo became the Duke of Normandy overlaps with the series, but this event took place exactly 66 years after the year 845, when Ragnar is thought to have besieged Paris. Therefore, Rollo and Ragnar neither lived in the same period nor were they brothers. The screenwriters, by showing different Viking leaders who lived in history as if they lived in the same period, both unlocked many new events to be told in the series and found the opportunity to show the audience the impact the Vikings created in Europe. However, this choice caused some events in history to be told in a jumbled way. Rollo's motivation to accept Charles III's offer is shown as jealousy towards Ragnar's rise. Although this choice contributes to the flow of the series, it does not reflect the facts in many respects. Harold Finehair's participation in the siege of Paris with Ragnar Lothbrok is another of the series' historical errors. In the series, Harold Finehair participates in the siege of Paris with Ragnar. His brother, Halfdan, also accompanies him in this siege. These two brothers are also involved in the Viking Civil War in the later episodes of the series. In reality, Halfdan and Harold were not brothers. In fact, Halfdan was Harold's father. In addition, it was not possible for Harold to be present at the siege of Paris. Because Harold was born an estimated 10 to 15 years after the year 845, when the Viking leader named Ragnar, who is thought to be Ragnar, besieged Paris. Therefore, he did not participate in the siege, nor was he a contemporary of Ragnar. One last event we need to focus on in this section is Ragnar's plan to capture Paris. This plan is actually quite admirable, but was the owner of the plan really Ragnar? No, he wasn't. This plan actually belongs to a Viking leader named Hastein, and the event has nothing in common with Paris or France. Hastein had set sail for the Mediterranean with Bjorn Ironside and had plundered some parts of Italy during this expedition. The plan was implemented by Hastein himself in Luna, one of the cities he plundered in Italy, and the city was successfully captured. Now let's fast forward the series a few more episodes. After his defeat against the Franks or Rollo, Ragnar goes into seclusion and disappears for a long time. In his absence, his sons grow up, and he himself gets old. Then he reappears and asks for help from his sons for the expedition he plans to make to England. While Bjorn, Ubbe, Hvitserk and Sigurd turn down Ragnar's offer, Ivar accepts this offer. Later, while Ragnar and Ivar are on their way to England with the men under their command, they are caught in a storm and lose most of their ships and men. After all these events, they helplessly take refuge with King Ecbert of Wessex. Ragnar asks King Ecbert to hand him over to King Ella, to spare Ivar's life, and to ensure his return to Kattegat. If he accepts this request, he promises that his sons will only take revenge on King Ella and will not attack Ecbert. Ecbert, after thinking for a while, understands what his benefit will be and accepts Ragnar's offer. Then Ragnar is handed over to King Ella as per the agreement. Ella, who had sworn to kill Ragnar years ago, takes this opportunity and executes him by throwing him into a pit full of poisonous snakes. Ivar, after returning to Kattegat, gives his brothers the news that their father was killed by Ella. Upon this, Ragnar's sons gather a large army and set out on an expedition to England to avenge their father. A large Viking army, called the Great Heathen Army by historians, did indeed land in the region of East Anglia in 865 and launched a large-scale invasion on the island. However, in the records of the period, there is no information that the leaders at the head of this army, such as Ivar and Ubbe, were Ragnar's sons. The information that this campaign was organized by his sons to avenge Ragnar is actually only told in the Scandinavian sagas. The way it is told in these sagas is also a little different from what is shown in the series. According to what is told in the sagas, Ragnar was quite disturbed that his son's fame surpassed his own. He had decided to organize a new expedition to regain his fame. However, Ragnar was now old, and his old fame was far away. Very few people had agreed to participate in this expedition with him. Also, contrary to what is told in the series, Ivar had not accompanied Ragnar on this expedition. Ragnar was defeated by King Ella in this expedition he set out on with a small number of men, and was executed by being thrown into a pit full of poisonous snakes. Unlike in the series, we do not find the information that King Ecbert handed Ragnar over to Ella in the sagas. According to the sagas, the way Ragnar's sons learned about this situation was also quite different from what is shown in the series. Accordingly, King Ella was quite pleased with the revenge he took on Ragnar. He had informed Ragnar's sons that Ragnar had been killed. Ragnar's sons were very angry at this event and swore that they would take revenge on King Ella. Now let's leave the legendary lines of the sagas and see what is told in the dusty records of history. According to Anglo-Saxon records, the Great Heathen Army set out from Scandinavia in 865 and landed in the region of East Anglia. This army had a large size for that period and consisted of several thousand warriors. At the head of the army were Viking leaders named Ivar, Ubbe, and Halfdan. There is no information in historical records that Ivar, Ubbe, and Halfdan were brothers. Also, the information that Ragnar was killed by King Ella and that this army came together for Ragnar's revenge is not included in the sources of the period. Modern historians mostly hold the view that these Viking leaders were not brothers who wanted to avenge their father, but leaders who aimed to settle in fertile lands with the warriors they brought with them. Many Viking attacks had been made on the island before, and as a result of these attacks, a large amount of loot had been obtained. Ubbe, Ivar, and Halfdan, to take advantage of this opportunity, made an agreement among themselves and gathered a larger army than ever before, and aimed to invade England with this army. The fact that these armies settled in different settlements on the island after the victories they won on the island also supports this view. Now let's focus on another character in the series. In the series, Floki is portrayed as someone who builds ships for them to set sail. He is also close friends with Ragnar. Floki participates in many raids with Ragnar until Ragnar's death. After Ragnar's death, he comes to England with Ragnar's sons and fights against King Ella. After this, he sets sail alone and leaves England. The storm that breaks out during his sea voyage drifts Floki's ship to the shores of Iceland. In this way, Floki, who discovers Iceland, returns to Kattegat and tells people about his discovery and goes back to Iceland with the people who want to settle on this newly discovered island. In history, there really was a sailor named Floki. However, unlike in the series, Iceland was not discovered by Floki, nor is the information that the person who built Ragnar's ships was Floki mentioned in any source. In reality, Iceland was accidentally discovered around the year 860 by a sailor named Gardar, who set out from Denmark with the aim of going to the Hebrides on the west coast of Scotland. Gardar's ship was caught in a storm during the journey, and this storm drifted him to Iceland. Since the lands of Iceland were quite barren, Gardar did not settle here and set sail again with the spring. After Gardar, a Viking named Nadod was also drifted to Iceland. After being caught in a storm during a journey, he set out on from Norway to the Faroe Islands. Floki, on the other hand, was the first among the Scandinavians to consciously visit Iceland. After seeing a fjord covered with icebergs on the island, he named the lands he found Iceland and was the person who gave the island its name. In other words, Floki had not accidentally discovered Iceland as in the series. He had information about the island and had come here not alone, but with his crew. In the continuation of the series, Ubba, one of Ragnar's sons, is shown as a Viking leader who pioneered the settlement of the Vikings in Greenland and America. However, at this point too, the series has not remained faithful to the facts. Greenland was discovered a century after Ubba's death in the 10th century by a sailor named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson. Gunnbjörn was drifted to the shores of Greenland after going off course due to a storm he was caught in during a sea voyage from Norway to Iceland, but he thought the island was not suitable for settlement. Therefore, he did not land and set sail again, reaching Iceland. The entire island would later be discovered by a Viking named Erik the Red. Erik the Red was also the person who gave the island the name Greenland. The fact that he gave the island the name Greenland, meaning Greenland, and the stories he told about this country soon led to the gathering of hundreds of Vikings who wanted to settle on the island around Erik. Erik, with these people with him, set out from Iceland and reached Greenland again and settled there. The first settlements established on the American continent were carried out under the leadership of Leif Erikson, the son of Erik the Red. In the series, during the expedition Ragnar makes to England with Ivar, Ragnar's ex-wife Lagertha, kills Ragnar's other wife Aslaug to capture the city of Kattegat and ascends the throne of Kattegat. Ivar, who returns to Kattegat after Ragnar is sent to King Ella by King Ecbert, swears revenge against Lagertha when he learns that his mother has been killed. First, avenging his father with his brothers, Ivar then decides that the time has come to avenge his mother and sets out, capturing Kattegat. The fact that Lagertha kills Ragnar's other wife Aslaug is not mentioned in any Scandinavian saga. The only similar event finds its place in the Gesta Danorum. According to what is told here, Lagertha had killed Ragnar as a result of an argument she had with him and had ascended his throne. However, since this event, which is only mentioned in the Gesta Danorum, is not mentioned in any other source, the historical reality of this event is quite doubtful. Also, the city of Kattegat, which caused the Viking Civil War in the series, never actually existed. In fact, Kattegat was not a city, but a sea between Denmark and Sweden. In the series, the civil war that takes place among the Vikings occupies a very important place. After Ivar captures the city, Bjorn, Lagertha and Ubba go to England and enter the service of King Alfred. After a while, they gather their forces and besiege Kattegat again, capturing the city. Ivar flees the city after this defeat and travels along the Silk Road in a miserable state. The soldiers of the Rus Prince Oleg, who hear that he is a former king, capture Ivar and bring him before Oleg. Oleg tells Ivar that he is also of Scandinavian origin and speaks to him in Old Norse. While Ivar is here, he witnesses some succession struggles. As a result of these struggles, Oleg ascends the Rus throne. Then Oleg, with the help of Ivar's prestige, sets out on an expedition to capture Scandinavia. Bjorn confronts the Rus army to prevent the Rus and Ivar from capturing Norway, but he is mortally wounded by Ivar during the battle. Despite this, he manages to defeat the Rus, but then he dies. The Rurik Dynasty, the founder of Kievan Ruses, was indeed of Scandinavian origin as told in the series. However, the members of this dynasty never returned to their homeland and were not interested in capturing the Scandinavia region. The lands of Scandinavia were quite barren. Even the Vikings, the native people of Scandinavia, were leaving these cold and barren lands and organizing raids on different parts of Europe or settling there. It would be a rather meaningless effort for the Rus to want to capture Scandinavia when there were many fertile lands and rich cities they could invade. Similarly, we do not find any data in history that could prove this situation. Therefore, the Rus never joined forces with Ivar and attacked Scandinavia. Bjorn Ironside did not die at the hands of Ivar. It is estimated that he died of natural causes while continuing his raids in the Mediterranean. So why did the screenwriters choose to tell a civil war that never happened in history? In history, the characters who are referred to as Ragnar's sons in the series started to live independently in different places after the invasion of England by the great heathen army. Since the stories of all the brothers would not be told separately in the series, it would have been easier to bring these characters together. Also, the struggle of the brothers seems like a much more gripping story than reality. For this reason, such a civil war scenario may have been created. In this way, the series continued for a few more seasons, and the audience was kept engaged with the series. However, this choice caused the series to completely separate from historical reality and start telling a completely different story. After Bjorn's death in the series, Kattegat is captured by the Norwegian king Harald Finehair. Ivar also leaves Kiev after a while and returns to Kattegat. While here, Ivar persuades Harald about the expedition to England and sets out on an expedition to England with him. In this expedition, the Vikings are defeated by King Alfred. Ivar and Harald lose their lives on the battlefield. In reality, Ivar had never been in Kiev. After his victories in England with the great heathen army, he had gone to Ireland and settled in the city of Dublin. Later, in 873, he probably died due to reasons brought by old age. His death was welcomed with joy by the Christian world, especially the Anglo-Saxons. So the relationships in the last season of the series are actually completely fictional. Again, towards the end of the series, we see King Alfred of Wessex's brother Ethelred planning a coup to depose Alfred by making a deal with the country's nobles. However, he gives up on this plan at the last moment. Despite this, his mother Judith learns of his coup plan, and to prevent such a situation from happening again, she kills Ethelred by putting poison in his wine. However, this event in the series has no historical reality. Unlike in the series, Ethelred's mother was not Judith but a woman named Osber. Also, the information that Ethelred was poisoned and killed by his mother is not found in any source. The fact that there was a disagreement between the two brothers is also not mentioned in the sources of the period. In addition, it is not possible that Ethelred had planned a coup attempt because, unlike in the series, Ethelred had ascended the throne before Alfred. The date he ascended the throne coincided with the arrival of the great heathen army on the island, and shortly after his accession to the throne, he died, probably of natural causes, after a series of battles with the Vikings. Alfred had ascended the throne after he died. Here too, the screenwriters have deviated from historical reality and have chosen to increase the viewing pleasure of the series. This event may have been designed especially to emphasize the cruelty in the dynasties and to better convey the conditions of the period to the audience. However, while designing this event, the screenwriters have once again deviated from historical facts. In conclusion, although the Viking series is a really good series in terms of viewing pleasure, quite good in terms of effects, and really beautiful in terms of scenario, when evaluated historically, it remains quite weak compared to other elements.